Hi, my name is Alan. I'm a business designer and welcome to the Beyond Users podcast, where we learn about business to become better designers. In the 36th episode, I spoke with Jason Barron. So Jason is a designer who decided to take an MBA. He actually attended one of the 40 top business schools, the Brigham Young University. And while he was there, he was taking visual notes, also called sketch notes, of all the business courses that he attended. So at the end, he decided to publish this in a book. So he's an author of The Visual MBA, which is a really great book explaining all the relevant business school concepts and frameworks through illustrations. So it's a perfect book for all designers who want to grasp some basic business concepts in a language that we designers are really well versed in, which are the images and illustrations. So definitely check out the book. And in this podcast, we talked about the decision for writing this book. Why did he decide to write a book and what was the initial spark that got the whole thing going? We also talked about his not favorite, but maybe most useful business courses that he attended in the MBA and what he didn't maybe find that helpful. So on one side, what he found helpful, and on the other side, what wasn't that helpful for him as a designer. And we also talked about his recommendations. So if he recommends to other designers to take an MBA or not. Just one more thing before diving into the episode. If you want to learn more about business, you can visit my website, beyondusers.com, and there you can take a 5-day email course, which I put together. It's called Mini MBA for Designers. And in these emails, I present 5 business concepts that are relevant for designers and that I've also used in my design process. So that's available on beyondusers.com. And now, without further ado, here is a conversation with Jason. Cool. Jason, let's jump straight into the topic. One thing that I'm really curious when I heard about your story is, why did you decide to take an MBA? What was the reason?
Alan, that's a great question, and thank you for having me on your podcast. So really, design is about crafting a solution to a problem or opportunity for people, and good business solves a problem. And the elegance and effectiveness of that solution are all about design. And so as a designer, I loved coming up with ways to improve people's lives by providing value in one shape or form. So, really, I've always loved art and design, and I've always loved business too. Even since I was a kid, I would go and mow people's lawns for money, and I've always just had this interest in business. And so, since that time, I've been involved in a couple startups, and I've just been fascinated by this close link between business and design. And there's not a lot of designers who are also focused on business as well. And I think it's a missed opportunity. I think there's designers by their trade are very much thinking about how to provide value to people. Mm-hmm. And that's what business is all about, but it's changing it so that way you're making money off of that by providing that value. So for me, I was just very interested in how I could improve my understanding of business so that way I could become a better designer and hopefully improve my decision making in the process. And so that's been a journey that has been really exciting for me. And I've been really grateful for the business principles that I've learned, and having that design background has provided a whole different perspective on your traditional business and how business operations work.
So would you say, was it the fascination with business that led you to MBA, or was it more the feeling that you're lacking certain knowledge?
I think it was a little bit of both. There were some key things that I was lacking. I wasn't super experienced in the financial side of business, about your typical financial tracking and how that whole world works with your balance sheets and your income statements and so forth. And so it really was it was the idea of just being curious and fascinated by that, but also knowing if I was going to do my own startup or in the startups that I've been in, that there obviously is some knowledge lacking, and I just wanted to fill that gap. So it really was the balance between those two, that fascination and the gap. And for me, by getting my MBA, it closed the gap, and it also helped satisfy that fascination that I had, and I walked away with some great knowledge.
So take us back to the time when you were part of the MBA program. How did that look like? Because I know a lot of designers who are thinking of taking an MBA. So I guess painting the picture of how this looks like might help them also make a decision.
Yeah. You know what? As a designer, I felt a little bit like a fish out of water when I was getting my MBA. So you had people that were focused on operations or finance or sales. And so I believe, from what I recall, I was one of the only designers. I actually think there was maybe two other designers in the group.
How big was the group?
It was about 70 people
Okay.
in our cohort. So we were together for the 2 years, that 70, that group of 70. And so I felt a little bit of as a fish out of water, but seeing that there were a couple of other designers there, and having since talked with some designers, and I have a good friend of mine who's a designer that's in an MBA right now. It helps me see that we're not the only ones. And so for your listeners who may be considering an MBA who are designers, I would say go for it. There's a lot of knowledge that can be gained that will help you in your craft as a designer, which we can talk a little bit about today. And there's a lot of value that you can gain in going through and gaining that education to have knowledge that will help benefit you as you're making decisions as a designer.
Yeah, so you mentioned the specific things that you learned and what are the benefits that you got out of it. What would you say was the most beneficial to you and to your design process?
You know, you had mentioned, Alan, that you work for IDEO, and part of that process with IDEOs, they have, first you empathize with people. Mm-hmm. And you define what problem that they're running into, and then you ideate ideas, and then you prototype those ideas, and then you test them. And that was something that was really reinforced in the MBA. I would say there was quite a few pieces to that beyond those principles that were taught by IDEO. Looking for something, a product or a business that balances the fact that it solves some kind of pain for people, that it's feasible in the market, and also, it's feasible to create, and that it's elegant. A lot of times we just think about, hey, I have an idea that I want to put out there in the market, but being able to kind of run it through some of these frameworks and some of these filters like that, where you're saying, what problem does this solve? Is it feasible, and is it elegant? That's been really helpful. Also, the idea of measuring. I think as designers, we're inherently creative, so we're on the right side of the brain. But being able to balance the right side of the brain with the left side of the brain when you're thinking about some of the kind of the quantitative or logical things and decisions that you need to make. So we spend a lot of time as designers on the right side, but learning how to balance that is a huge benefit as well. So that we are thinking about what are your measures and your goals, those signals and metrics that you're thinking about as you're creating value for people. Also, just how you get adoption for your product in design. So, does it have superior benefits? I talk about in the book sort of this adoption scale. So, how is the pricing? Does it have superior benefits? As I had mentioned, is it easy to use? Is it easy to purchase? So a lot of these things that really influence how you would design a product were taught in business school, and I have them in the book as well. And so really these different frameworks and ways of thinking about a problem, so that way you're not spending your time in something that really just doesn't matter much. A lot of times we can get lost in the weeds with details rather than kind of pulling back and thinking about, well, is this actually solving a problem?
Mm.
And it may be solving a problem, but is it feasible? I mean, maybe this is way too complex. Or maybe it's feasible and it solves a problem, but is it elegant? And we know that really with design can be a competitive advantage for companies as they think about their products. And so very much some huge learnings there that have benefited me as a designer. And so, overall, those learnings have been super beneficial.
If we could teach our listeners one framework, so you talked a lot about the feasibility, how to add the feasibility aspect to desirability that we designers are so good at. So if we can give our listeners one framework for either measuring or for anything that you find very helpful in your design process. So a framework that you learned in the d.MBA and that you also talk about in the book, which one would you recommend and maybe now talk about and kind of describe how we can use it?
Alan, I think the one that is most comprehensive that will help people immediately, those who are listening to this right now could use this today in their companies and their ideas, really is that framework I had mentioned through IDEO, which is, starting with empathy, defining the problem, ideating, prototyping, and testing. So an example is, and you could certainly talk to this maybe even better than I can for sure. But really, you go and if you're hearing about an issue that's happening, maybe it's that there's in your local city there are issues that are that people are running into, be it politically or maybe it's an operational issue, or people are frustrated by one thing or another, and actually going and visiting with those people and talking with them and watching how they operate and watching in the context of their job or the context of their environment, what does that look like for them, and really putting yourself in their shoes so that way you can feel how they feel, and based on that, the problem starts to become clear, and you're able to take that and really define it. I think about kind of on that empathy factor. I don't know if your listeners or you have been to Disneyland or Disney World. When Walt Disney was creating Disneyland, what he did was he walked around Disneyland and he would get down on one knee, so that way he could see what Disneyland would look like from the view of a child. And it was all about empathizing with his audience to then understand what is missing and what problem exists there. And so really empathizing, putting yourself in their shoes. And then from there, as I mentioned, that problem becomes clear and you're able to really succinctly define the problem. So once you've defined that problem, then you're able to come up with a lot of ideas. And I talk about in the book about convergence versus divergence. So in the ideation phase, which is the third step, so there's empathize, define, now we're in ideate. When you're in that phase, you're doing what's called divergence. And so you're coming up with all kinds of ideas on how you might solve that problem. And the world's the limit. You're not thinking, you're not critiquing the ideas that you're having. You're not thinking about why they won't work. What you're doing is you're just coming up with a lot of different ideas. And so you go to a whiteboard or get sticky notes and just write down a ton of different ideas, get a group of people, 5 to 8 people, and just come up, brainstorm with a lot of different ideas and diverge. And then really after you do your divergence, then you put on your critical hat, which is that you think about, okay, now that we have all of these ideas, it's really important not to try and critique it in the ideation like in the divergence process. But once you've come up with a bunch of ideas, then you kind of converge. And so you start thinking critically about, okay, well, what will work, what won't work, and what can we do to, what is feasible and what is not, until you come down to, a couple ideas. And then from there you prototype that. idea, and this can be really rough. It can be something where it's just paper, and you're cutting out pieces of paper and laying them out for somebody, and then you test that and have people actually go through and use it, and then you gain some key learnings that help you really go through that cycle again. And so again, that one framework I would say is tremendously valuable for people to solve big problems. Again, to repeat: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. That's a fantastic framework.
Yeah, definitely. I've used it myself a lot of the times. What I found out is also that the final step seems to be tricky for a lot of designers, the testing part. Not in actually doing the tests, but in actually then estimating the results, if you know what I mean. So I'm curious, like, if you have any tips for us, how would you, or maybe even an example of the project you've done, and then how did you estimate the test? Once you actually have a prototype, you put it out there. How do you know if it has gone certain way or the other way? What should you do after that?
That's a great question. So a couple thoughts on that. So in the book, I talk about different ways to critique something. So once you've shown your prototype to people and you're testing it, there's a couple ways you can evaluate the success of that. One is, what friction do they run into, or do they run into friction at all? But what points do they run into friction? So immediately you can see, okay, they actually didn't understand this one part, or they missed this one step or something. So what's kind of keeping them from being successful in using this product that you have? And then, from there, once you've kind of resolved the friction, I talk about 6 thinking hats, and I talk about how you can ask them on a scale of 1 to 10 whether or not they would purchase it. You can ask them what are the perceived benefits that they have, what are the shortcomings that they see with this product, what ideas do they have on improving it, and then kind of summarizing what those learnings are. That's a really good way to kind of vet the idea as you're testing it. I'll give you an example actually with the book. So when I created this book initially, I actually took this process where I created a prototype. I had my sketch notes that I took from class, and on paper, I printed them out on a computer, and then had them on printer paper. I took a glue stick, glued the pages together, and I had one chapter glued together with the cover of the book as a prototype. I mean, this is just really rough, and it didn't have to be pretty, but it felt like a sort of the semblance of the book. And I was looking for people to give me ideas and tell me what was wrong with it, or what could be improved, or what perceived benefits that they had, as I talked about with those 6 thinking hats. And so I took that around the class to different classmates, and I said, hey, take a look at this. What are your thoughts? And I gained a ton of learnings, an amazing amount of learnings that I was able to then go back, refine my prototype based on their feedback, refine that, and then reprint it again based on their feedback, glue it all together again. So I know I had sort of a version 2 of my prototype, and then did the same exact process where I walked around and showed people and got their feedback. And for me, it's just this constant, you're gaining insights, and you're seeing, hey, there's an interest here. If there's an interest, then it's worth pursuing. And I think that's the biggest thing, is making sure that you're asking people who will be honest with you about whether or not they would actually buy this thing. And that's a good way to do it too, where you're showing it to them. And if it's someone most likely they're going to say, oh, that's cool. But when you ask them, maybe you don't even ask them if you would buy it. You ask them how much would they pay. That can be a really good indicator whether or not they would even buy this thing that you have. And so, when I went through that process with the book and I got feedback from people, I got so much good feedback that if I hadn't have done that, if I would have just printed the book, I would guarantee that the book wouldn't be as successful as it has been. And because I went through that actual process and prototyped and tested, now I have a much more valuable product that has gone around the world.
Yeah, that's a really cool approach. I'm just curious, like, can you share one thing that you learned in that feedback from your colleagues, and then how does that trickle down into the book now?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting when I did the first initial. So when I was doing my sketch notes, I was drawing with these concepts that the teachers and professors were talking about, and I was breaking these complex ideas down. And when I did that first prototype, I showed my classmates. And for the readers who have the book, you'll notice that there are these illustrations and then there's some explanations. Well, on the original version, I just had illustrations with some minor notes and things kind of pointing to things. And they said, you know what, as a reader, I appreciate the illustrations of what you have, but it would be really helpful having some explanations about what you're actually talking about here, because the illustrations aren't quite enough. And that became the backbone of having the explanations. And so, now really a big bulk of the book, in addition to the illustrations, is the explanations. And initially in that first prototype, I didn't have that. And so much would have been lost with people in actually understanding what's being taught if I would have just gone with that first version, was just had the illustrations with some minor notes. But now that I have the illustrations coupled with that additional information, it's really put it together in a way that people understand really clearly.
That's a really cool example, because it's one of those things that when you look at a final product, it kind of just feels obvious that there is text and sketches. But I guess when you are actually designing the thing, there's so many decisions that you're not even asking yourself. My first idea was just to have sketches, right? If it's the visual MBA book, then it's just sketches. So cool. I guess since now we talked about the book already a lot, like maybe let's also go step by step and talk about the process. So first of all, I'm interested in, how did you even get the idea for the book?
I was I was introduced to the idea of sketchnoting, which essentially is, you draw the concepts that you're hearing, and it helps you with retention, and it helps you with recall later. And it helps basically provide a quick reference for people as they're, going back to their notes. And someone had introduced that to me several years ago. And there's a book by Mike Road who wrote this book called The Sketchnote Handbook. And I bought that book and really looked at this idea of sketchnoting. And I started doing that at conferences. I would sketchnote and draw the concepts. And I was surprised at the effectiveness of that approach, and really helping me recall information, where in the past, I'm sure you're familiar, and like all of us, sometimes when you're taking notes, you're just taking linear notes, and either you never go back and read them, or they're just not as effective. But with sketchnoting, I saw that it was just way more effective for actually capturing the ideas and helping me recall them later. So I knew about that concept. I knew it was a fairly new concept, and I knew it was pretty unique. And I had this thought at the beginning of my program that I wanted to sketchnote it. And I also thought, you know what, there's probably no one that's crazy enough to actually go through and sketchnote their entire 2-year MBA program. I'm gonna give that a shot and see. And at the very beginning, I didn't necessarily think I would put it in a book. I mean, I had some ideas, and maybe like kind of fleeting, like, hey, maybe I could do that, but it wasn't anything I was necessarily had a hard plan on. But as I went through class, I was just, as the professor was talking, I was drawing what they were talking about and breaking down the concepts and helping clearly define those in as I was sketching. And as I went through that process, some of my classmates would lean over and be like, "Hey, that is really cool. Like, what are you doing?" And so I would explain it, and they would say, "Hey, if you put those in a book, I will buy it at the end of the year." And so that's where really kind of the idea kind of got some traction, and I just had that, the idea to just continue with that. And so near the end of the program, I'd mentioned already that kind of that prototyping and testing, that was sort of midway through the program to help me refine my process. And then at the end of the program, I thought, you know what, I'm going to put this together in a book. I called a publisher and asked how much it would cost to print maybe 200 copies or so. I thought, hey, maybe I could sell this to my class and maybe the previous class, and that, was in the program that graduated the previous year. Maybe I could sell it to them, and maybe the class that's next year. And the publisher or the printer said, hey, if you actually do a Kickstarter, you could really know how many copies to print, and it'll actually be less expensive rather than trying to do a smaller number and then kind of grow that from there, right away. And so that's where that idea to do a Kickstarter came from. So I did a Kickstarter campaign. I set it for 28 days and, set the goal for $7,000. And then after just a few short days, it had already reached the goal. And then by the end of the 28 days, it had raised over 1,000%. So it had raised over $70,000 from 40 countries around the world. And so that's where I saw that there was a keen interest in this overall idea. And since then, the publisher has picked it up and has printed it globally. And so I've just been really, really happy with the overall process and that this book is providing value for people all over the world and helping them understand and learn business concepts in a way that has never been presented that way before. And it's much more approachable and helps people get up to speed a lot faster. So it's been a really crazy, wild journey where I've just kind of been going along and adapting and adjusting as I go, just like we do as designers, and trying to find value, trying to provide value for people.
Yeah. No, it's a really cool book, even for those who already have some business knowledge. For me, it was really a nice way to get reminded of a few things, or maybe even see how I can explain a few things better, right? Because I think you learn the most when you try to also teach somebody or explain something. I guess even in this process, you learn a lot of these business concepts even better. And just by seeing them sketched, I at least got a better idea of how I can talk about something. Because a lot of these business books are really dry, a lot of jargon, and it becomes like really, really hard to get through. But
exactly, yeah.
One thing you mentioned, the Kickstarter, so I want to touch upon the Kickstarter a little bit. Like having just a $7,000 goal and then achieving or raising $73,000, that's a really, really good result. So I'm just curious, like, how did you do your marketing for the Kickstarter campaign? Was that completely organic, or did you put any strategy behind?
So basically with Kickstarter, what you need to do is you put together your campaign. And one of the ways that you can get a lot of visibility is by getting on their Projects We Love category. So basically what Kickstarter does is it curates the site, looks for promising projects that are on Kickstarter, and then it kind of helps promote them. And the way you have to do that is you have to get a lot of buzz going for your project on Kickstarter for them to kind of promote it. So essentially what I did was, I had a plan to reach out to some influencers in this space, Mike Road being one of those, and ask them to kind of to share it on Twitter and some other social channels. And so that was really the extent of the marketing plan. So what I did was I once I launched it, well, actually, let me step back just a second. One of the things that I did and actually talk about in the book is the need when you're doing marketing to have a positive personal connection with people. And so what I did with my marketing was I created a video that was of my two kids, and it was them talking about the book. And they were talking about how their dad doodles during class, and you're not supposed to doodle during class, and it was just this fun, this fun thing about my kids, trying to be, that are more mature than their dad, and they're, talking about this idea. And it was just a really fun, cute approach to talking about the book. So once I launched the Kickstarter, I asked Mike Road and a couple other social influencers to talk about it. And I also shared it on my social channels, and people saw my kids on there and they just thought it was really cute and adorable. And so they would share it. And so really it helped generate a lot of buzz, really, really quickly. I think within the first 24 hours, Kickstarter added it to their Projects We Love category. And that's what really was a really big deal, because Kickstarter is essentially promoting that project to thousands of their visitors. And that's really what helped create the snowball of awareness that really, really made the project successful.
Oh, got it. Cool. And did I understand correctly that you first self-published the book and then you got a publisher, or was it you got a publisher right after the Kickstarter campaign?
You know what? I first self-published it. So I once I finished the Kickstarter, then I put in the order with a printer, and I had a printer print out all of those copies of the book, both hardcover and softcover. So I did that all on my own, and then individually shipped the books all over the world, which was a huge task. I mean, we had tons of boxes of books and just books everywhere, and we were just shipping books nonstop because I wanted to make sure that we were keeping our commitment to our backers and getting to them, getting the book to them on time. And so it was just insane. But yeah, that was initially, it was self-publishing that, and that's when the publisher had a really keen interest in the book and the idea, and so that's when they picked it up and did some tweaks, and then we had that published internationally starting in April of this year. So initially, to answer your question, yes, self-published initially, and then going through a publisher after that. And for me, it was really worth going through a publisher because the packing and shipping and distribution and printing and everything involved in the process for a book was a massive undertaking, and it was a lot of work. And so having a publisher do the distribution and everything for me has been a really good decision.
Yeah. And had the content also changed? I'm just kind of asking, like, once you have an editor and they start maybe also looking at the content, did you also then move things around and change the content itself, or was it mostly just the back end that changed of the business?
You know what? There were some just minor changes, just some minor tweaks and changes, some grammatical things that were updated, but there were no significant changes throughout the book. Really, what is published today is really close to what the original was.
Okay, cool. So you did a good job the first time around.
Well, I did a sufficient job. So it was nice to have that a professional editor go through and really with a fine tooth comb and go through and make some tweaks. And so I feel really good about this final version that's published now.
Out of all of those things that MBAs cover, they cover for everything from accounting, macroeconomics, down to marketing, etc. What did you find the most helpful as a designer, and what was maybe felt kind of not that helpful or like a baggage?
Yeah, I would say as a designer, it was really helpful in the classes about decision making, about financials. I'd mentioned with designers, intuition is really important with design, but sometimes we can rely too much on just intuition. And so balancing intuition with observation and data will help you be a more powerful designer. And so for me, the classes that we're talking about, data, observation, better judgment, decision-making, analyzing a problem from multiple angles and looking at alternatives and then narrowing down to a final solution. To me, that was super helpful. The classes that we're talking, like the financial reporting class, was really helpful because finances in the past just weren't something I was super interested in or even cared about. And so going in that class, it was really helpful because as a business owner doing a startup or anything, you have to be keeping an eye on your finances. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to create a life-changing product. And so that was super helpful. I would say some of the things I guess one key area that I felt like wasn't necessarily helpful for me specifically was in one of the finance classes when it was talking about depreciating assets,
Yeah.
and how you calculate the depreciation of your equipment for, your business. To me, that was not super useful. I'm sure it's useful to many people that have a business that has a lot of equipment and things, but for me, that just wasn't as valuable. But I would say for sure, the vast majority of what I learned was super valuable for my role as a designer, and it was definitely worth the time.
I noticed also that in the book you use the example of the lemonade stand a lot. Is that something that also you used or the professors used in the MBA, or was it just you trying to present the book or the concepts in a way that are easier to understand?
That's a great question. That was actually me doing that, and because you had the professors that were talking about these complex ideas, and I felt like to make this much more approachable, the same ideas could be shared in a simplified way. And I'm a big believer in simplification. And so anything we can do to simplify concepts to be more understandable, I think is a really good thing. And so for me, it was a deliberate effort to take these complicated and complex ideas and just make them simple. And if rather than talking about the operations of a multi-million-dollar company and all the complexities that come with that, I talked about operations of a lemonade stand, and how you prepare lemonade, and your materials of sugar and your materials of lemons, and it was just that the way I felt like it would be much easier and better to consume for people, so that way they still walked away with the same understanding, but they didn't have to process and think through all the complexities of other examples. So that was a deliberate effort, to break those concepts and those complicated ideas down, so that way they were easier to understand.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a great decision because, in general, like when we are learning, we are looking for these fundamentals, and breaking this down to the most basic example is how we usually learn the fundamentals, and the more complex cases then come after that. And if we try to jump straight into complicated cases, then many people don't even get the fundamentals. So I think that was a great
Right.
decision for the book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Jason, just as a final question, maybe where can listeners find more about you and about the book?
It's a great question. So, on the book is available in bookstores around the world, and you can get it on Amazon.com. Also, if I'm going to be publishing some sketch notes and ideas on Instagram, so if you want to get in touch, please reach out on Instagram. It's at Visual MBA. So that's probably the best place to reach me and follow what's going on. Also, jasonbarron.com. That's BARRON.com. I'll have some updates there, but really the best way and the main social channel that I'm using for Visual MBA work is at Visual MBA through Instagram. And again, I would love any feedback from any listeners. What could I do better? What thoughts do you have and ideas, or what business problems are you going through? And we can talk through different ideas together. I love the design community. I love how it really is a brother and sisterhood, and we're all kind of in this together as we work through to solve, as we solve problems that people are facing around the world. And it's just a really exciting space to be in. And so please feel free to reach out again at Visual MBA on Instagram. And I'd love to continue the conversation. And Alan, this has been a true pleasure. I appreciate you having me on your show. And I look forward to learning from you as time goes.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you definitely for taking the time, and also for putting together the book. So putting in the hours and the stamina to put together this, I think, very, very useful book. Yeah. Thank you too.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. We'll see ya.